the structure of the presentation, which is now somewhat abbreviated, but it's in three parts. I talk about, which has already been mentioned, this sort of split between the subjective and the objective, the inner and the outer. Why is that the case, especially within the field of sustainability? So I just briefly touch on that. And then discuss how we might link the two. How do we do bridge work or translational research on the subjective and the objective within sustainability research? And finally, I talk about, as you mentioned, the project that we work on in Potsdam and how we do it as one possible approach that might be inspiring for you. So there are a couple actually, and I think this was quoted in your teacher, Christine Wamsler article. These are meta-analyses actually on subjectivity within the field of sustainability and why it's not really a hot topic of research, that it has been getting very little attention. So they document the studies that have been done on subjectivity within sustainability, but they found that there are very few. And one of the reasons, which also Tom mentioned earlier, is that, again, these two fields, you had this graphic of sustainability over here and sort of consciousness or well-being, psychology research are very separate, right? And there are a few other meta-analyses that document the studies that have been done and find that there are very few studies within sustainability that bridge these two fields. And one of the articles that was on your reading list for today's class documents this within the field of socio-technical transitions. And this is this sort of documented research within the last 10 years on socio-technical transitions. And this is within that body of literature how much is connected to the field of psychology or well-being. Right? So it's a small share of the overall body of work. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because this work in psychology on the inner dimensions of sustainability is primarily from the disciplines medicine and psychology, which are focused on the individual, much less on social systems or on structures. And they also tend to be stuck in a sort of individualistic or cognitivist paradigm where they're thinking of well-being or psychology in terms of brain, you mentioned, in terms of neuroscience research. In terms of mindsets or dispositions, personality characteristics, but don't necessarily relate that to the individual's relationship to other individuals, to social groups, or to the environment in general. So people within the field of sustainability who are focused on those larger order systems often don't pay so much attention to the field of work in psychology and well-being. Another reason, though, is that psychology, just as a discipline, tends to isolate variables because it works within an experimental context, which is, again, very different from sustainability researchers. Increasingly, we're moving towards transdisciplinary forms of research, which are trying to understand complexity within real-world settings, right? And so they're not trying to isolate variables in an experimental lab or an experimental context, but they're trying to understand social relationships, social systems. So again, the connections between this body of literature within psychology aren't so strong to the field of sustainability. Having said that, though, there is a documented increase of the share of studies within socio-technical transitions literature that are focused on psychology. So at least that's encouraging. Probably none of us would be here if we didn't already understand the relevance of the inner or the subjective with the outer or the systemic. But just to sort of highlight some of what you've already mentioned, Tom, there's this dramatic gap between the way we understand sustainability conventionally in terms of green technology, governance, and policy, and the human element, right? And we understand that we're not able to make a lot of progress on sustainability because there's this gap. Because there's this gap between the knowledge that's produced in the field and the action that's taken. So there needs to be basically greater consideration of how technology, governance, policy, the more conventional or outer systemic dimensions of sustainability really relates to the human elements, behavioral pattern structures, and mental models. Operationally, though, it's difficult to actually link these two, the subjective and the objective. So I'll mention a few sort of theoretical or conceptual frameworks that before, though, I just want to mention this is a very good, also it's in your reading list, meta-analysis of religion by Brown Taylor. And what he finds, he compiles all these mainly sociological studies of religion from different areas. What he finds is that there isn't really an influence on the environmental movement among many different religious groups. That there isn't a sort of emerging political activism around the environmental movement, but you would hope to see within institutional religions. And so, though there are, certain threads within religion, sort of eco-theology or sort of more progressive wings of institutional religion, by and large, religion is not a very progressive force in terms of advancing sustainability. So that's important to keep in mind what the limits are. So we have to start also broadening our lens in terms of how to shift mindsets, that it's not just focused on conventional religion, that it's much broader. This is a theoretical framework, again, also in your reading list by David Manuel Navarrete, who tries to couple these social systems and ecological systems and understanding this bidirectional causality between the two in terms of subjective experience and how it can be integrated both in symbolic and material dimensions. And to your point, what he's focused on is this underlying relationship pattern between individuals, groups, and systems, and how subjectivity is linked to socio-ecological systems in the sense that people within the system can choose to change their relationship to others within the system in a conscious, cognitive way, that it's a cognitive complex system, as you mentioned. And then within that understanding, what we would like to see is a greater alignment or congruence between one's own subjectivity, one's own values, one's own intentionality, and the actual manifestation of that within a systemic structure, so that it matches one's values, intentionality, and subjectivity. Another way to do that operationally is to map out within an organization or an institution these various individual, collective, interior and exterior factors and how to align those. This is coming from integral theory, work pioneered by Wilbur, but expanded by others in the last 10 or 15 years. Within, especially like organizational psychology and studies, to understand what is the link between individual, collective, interior, and exterior factors. And there have been studies on this, one of which, quoted here, found that the congruence between these improves the success within the organization. For those who are interested in investigating these links, I also want to mention that there are four sort of methods that also in the research that's listed for the course that are really already integrating the social and the personal. So identity-based theories are, because identity is inherently sort of social, we're not vacuums, right? We construct our identity also in relationship to others and to systems, and so that is one very tangible way to get traction on this issue. Another is values. The same way that our own personal values are shaped by our relations to others and to systems, we can start to study that. Socio-cognitive, as opposed to just sort of what I mentioned is traditional psychology literature that's overly cognitive, but this is socio-cognitive, so it's already making that link between social relations and systems to how one thinks. And my own sort of personal interest and favorite is this situated cognitive approaches to psychology, which increasingly are also termed 4E cognition. The 4 E's, there's embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended, is a way of understanding the mind not as in the head, right, as cognitive, but as actually in the body also, in one's understanding of oneself in relation to the body, and then also enacted, in action, right, in behavior, and then extended in the environment, in your relationship to the environment, and embedded also within cultural and social contexts. So there are people operationally within psychology who are defining the mind or inner transformation in this way that allows them to get traction on socio-ecological issues because they're understanding the mind or inner transformation in relations to others and to the environment. And they're able to, again, operationalize that in experimental context where they can study that empirically. It's quite interesting. This is all newer, so it's certainly not mainstream. This comes from another article that's in your required reading list, I think, by David Manuel Navarrete, where he links the inner and outer world in this term ecological integrity, which, to unpack it, just basically revolves around this notion of narratives, that our shared social and cultural narratives create an intrinsic bond between the outer world and our inner world, because how we think about the world, our dreams, our fantasies, our emotional responses, is in many ways creating the world that we would like to see, the process of world building, right? This is just a list of some of the cultural narratives that sort of position us in relationship to the environment. And here you see like bright green environmentalism we've talked about already, this emphasis on technology. That's going to fix the problems. Let's just look outside for the solution. And there's a sort of newer movement, ecological modernization, where we think that, you know, the economy can just continue to grow and we don't put growth into question, but that we can make it more efficient and talk about resource use and sort of just that'll fix the problem. But then you see also, from more humanistic perspective or social scientific perspective, these other discourses that are really questioning this, as you call nature and culture bifurcation or division, that I find really interesting, and that, to the point I made earlier, are really drawing our attention back to so many of the traditions that have never really been dualistic in their understanding of nature and culture. So a lot of these narratives, in one way or another, are creating worlds. We are all inevitably world building all the time. But what's important is to recognize that we're world building, and then to, as I said, make our values, our worldviews congruent with that process of building systems and structures. So that, as you said, sort of the systems and structures reflect our own intentionality, because I think the problem that we currently have is that they don't. And we're also not conscious about how to change the systems and structures so that they're more in line with our intentionality. What we do as a project and how we approach this link between inner and outer transformation. Starting from the assumption, again, that sustainability is not just out there, but that it's shaped as much by our activities as it is by the mindsets through which we see the world. And one of the models, actually, which we are inspired by is Donella Meadows' leverage points, because that sort of contextualizes the manifestations of sustainability or unsustainability and looks at their connection to these underlying patterns of behavior, systemic structures, and finally mental models. And as a project, we've sort of taken this original framework by Donella Meadows and adapted it. And then under here, I don't know if you can see it very well, but we sort of deconstruct mental models as a singular thing into three different categories, which Tom mentioned earlier. One is ethics, another is worldviews, and another is ontologies. And of course, there are many different ways to parse that out. We could have chosen different terms or different categories, but those are three broad ways of understanding inner transformation, subjectivity, values, worldviews, attitudes, dispositions, in a way that's well defined within different bodies of literature, in which we're able to then get traction with. So, as a project, we're then adapting that understanding of ethics, ontologies, and worldviews to this relational framework so that we can understand the relationship between these inner dimensions, these subjective dimensions, and these different orders of complex systems. So that the intrasubjective, which is just a fancy way to say subjectivity, right? What's going on within me. We want to understand that divided into these three categories in relationship to my relationship to you, my relationship to organization like Luxus or to this university, to a cultural environment, right? So could be subcultures, could be larger order cultures, institutions, which could also just be like law or money, right? Something much more pervasive. And then socio-technical structures like capitalism or technology, the ways in which that's global. And finally, this relation between the human social system and the earth system. And so we're trying to map within the research project, a website now where we're curating data from many different disciplines and people to start mapping these bodies of literature on inner transformation and subjectivity in their relationship to these different orders, systems, and structures, right? So, just to give you an example, we might have someone who's done a study on mindfulness, because it's really popular, for example, and its connection to consumer behavior, right? And then we would locate it somewhere on this chart. Is it, where would that be? Is it resource use within an organization, or is it, we would locate studies in different spheres of influence and how they relate to these inner dimensions. In addition to all of that, we also have a particular orientation, which is important to mention. And it was already mentioned. So the orientation that is sort of dominant today is based on sort of the Enlightenment, right, tradition of Western thinking that understands things not from a complex systemic perspective, which increasingly is getting traction within different disciplines, but still the Enlightenment sort of defines ontology in terms of substances, in terms of discrete entities, in terms of things, essences, right? And that's still somewhat pervasive, even though it's 300 years old, right? And as a result, then also takes a mechanistic worldview, which means that it understands things in relationship to each other only externally, in terms of external relationships and not internal relationships, okay? And then it also perhaps has a utilitarian ethic in which these things, right, are functionally related to me as a resource or as utility, as opposed to something with, again, internal relationship. And this is just one possible way of characterizing sort of the modern or dominant paradigm that has existed for hundreds of years, but still is an anomaly within the larger scheme of things. And our orientation as a project, because we're within a think tank focused on sustainability, we're interested in what we term as sort of ecological paradigm, right? And what are the components of that? How does that characterize? One is it's characterized by a relational ontology in which things aren't discrete substances, but they're always in relationship to varying orders of complexity. An organismic worldview, again, in which there are organisms of organisms, societies of societies, is sort of holonic in a way, and an ecocentric ethic in which individuals' interests aren't pitted against other individuals or other groups, but that there's an understanding of these relationships, and higher order systems are prioritized in some sense to lower order systems. And then now I'm going to get to your questions like, what are each of these things within the bodies of literature that we're looking at? How are they defined? So first is ecological ethics, and then I'll get into worldviews and then ontologies. And this is sort of a shorthand for what we mean as a project by a mindset for the Anthropocene. Ethics, we're all probably familiar with, are guidelines for behavior, which include, but aren't limited to, like virtues or social contracts, rights, and morals. There are many different varieties of ecological ethics, but within the sort of more radical tradition of ecological ethics, also the newer bodies of literature, there's four large sort of traditions. One is deep ecology, which focuses more on the spiritual religious perspectives and how they understand the intrinsic value of nature. Another is social ecology, which focuses more on hierarchy and domination, how social hierarchy informs our relationship to nature. A third is ecofeminism, which considers the links between not just feminists, but minority groups in general, and how we treat minorities and how that impacts our relationship to nature. And then last is posthumanism, which really just calls into question the notion of humanism, which comes from, again, the Enlightenment. Is the human discrete from the environment? Is it somehow separate from the environment? They say no, and then they try to really nuance that and try to understand the human in socio-ecological systems. These are just like some prominent authors who are defining sort of feminist posthumanism, which is an even sort of smaller subfield, which I find quite interesting. Donna Haraway, many people know, has written this book just lately. I mean, she has many, but Staying with the Trouble is her sort of one of her more recent books, in which she talks about interspecies relationships. And what I find interesting too is the way she defines species is not just biological, zoological, but she also understands the cyborgic, right, as a sort of species, because the root of species comes from kind, so a sort of kind, and so she understands our relationship to both other species and other animals, plant, human, non-human, but also technology, and she tries to blur those boundaries. Rosie Braidotti is another posthumanist author, and Jane Bennett, also a new materialist, is interested in locating agency outside the individual in larger order systems and processes, so that agency then becomes distributed. And it's really interesting reading her work, because you can also, from a social scientific perspective, then see energy systems as an example, as having agency, right? Or you can see infrastructure as having agency. Worldviews are defined as systems of meaning and meaning-making that substantially inform how humans interpret, enact, and co-create reality, and thus contain, for example, values and environmental attitudes. And also in your reading list, there's some work by Annika Lund that I've included because she, as an environmental sociologist, has written some really good studies that demonstrate what are the common characteristics of a more sustainable worldview. And she's done empirical studies on that. And the framework she uses is called the Integrative Worldview Framework, which sort of takes prior studies on worldviews, puts them together, packages them in this framework, and then empirically validates them to see what is more or less sustainable. The modern worldview being, again, from the sort of Enlightenment tradition, rational, secular, and humanist, instrumental in the way it understands nature as a resource, materialistic and individualistic, mechanistic, dualistic, reductionist, industrial, and optimistic in terms of the capacity of technology to solve the problem. As opposed to an ecological worldview, which is pluralist, recognizes both unity and diversity, is interested in the integration of humanity and nature, sees nature as intrinsically, not just extrinsically valuable, and constructs a planetary ethic. And again, that's just sort of a summary of so much other work, some of which is represented here, that is informing our understanding of what an ecological worldview is. Some of the disciplines include eco-psychology, deep ecology, environmental sociology, social psychology, ecological economics, interrural ecology, indigenous studies, and developmental psychology and sustainability. So these are some of the authors and bodies of literature that we're using also to inform how we understand ecological worldviews as a shift away from the sort of dominant modern worldview. And lastly, ontologies it's related to worldviews, but it's more fundamental in terms of how it understands our view of reality. So onto just means being. So it's the study of being, what is, right? Quite philosophical. But this has an immense impact on everything else, because if we describe the fundamental aspects of the world like mind and matter as separate, that's a particular ontology, that's a substance ontology I mentioned. Or if we understand them as related, that's a relational ontology. There are different versions of ontologies, some that are more or less ecological. And again, in Christine Wamsler's article, she mentions how important ontology is because it shapes how knowledge is constructed in general, but also within the field of sustainability. And with the dominant substance ontology, there's no way in which non-material causation, say spirituality or inner transformation, subjectivity, really has an impact on the external world in a way that you can study or discuss in a professional way. So it's important to look at ontology as a framework. And these are prominent, philosophers, scientists who have defined the sort of modern dominant worldview and ontology. And Newton, as I mentioned, came up with this idea that everything is externally, not internally related. You probably heard about the billiard ball universe, right? Kant talked about, in his transcendental thesis, how nothing could be understood with outside of its relationship to one's own subjectivity. You can't get outside your own mind, and that mind and matter are separate. Hume said that mind and matter are separate, but that science understands the truth of matter, that you could separate your subjectivity from the object, right? And again, like STS, Science Technology Studies, puts all that into question. Like, how can you as a researcher, as a scientist, somehow absolve yourself of the research that you're doing and not have an impact on it? It doesn't. But for so many years, right, that's the sort of story that we've been told. And it started, a long time ago. Hume was a philosopher who made that thesis. And Bacon, which you've already mentioned, had the thesis that nature can be mastered in a very gendered way. Talked about nature as a female, that it can be manipulated and, And Descartes, again, obviously, we all know, separated mind and body. So we just want to contrast that with these newer ways of thinking about ontology that are inherently relational and, as a result, ecological and more sustainable, because they try to reconcile this split that happened between mind and matter, subjectivity and objectivity, identity and difference. And it's similar to almost the neuron map that you showed earlier, that we are beings, we have distinct identities, but we're also identities in relationship. And this is a final diagram that summarizes our own understanding as a project, because we're trying to, whereas before I had these like layered or embedded spheres, right? This sort of nested diagram. That's an easier way to conceptually understand it in terms of like an empirical study, to sort of draw the connections between the different layers. But it's not perfect, because we actually don't also understand those different layers as like hierarchical, right? And so we're starting to like to use this diagram, which it almost resembles an atom and an electron in the way that there's a certain field of relationships between these different spheres, but not a field, not one of which is characterized by a hierarchy, right? So we're trying to also understand these different connections between socio-technical, institutional, cultural, organizational, and intersubjective different relationships, systems, and structures to the intersubjective, to what's going on in me in a relationship that's non-dual, right? And that's what we're trying to map in our research project, if that makes sense. And then the final step after we do that sort of mapping is to take groups of stakeholders who are focused on a concrete or context-specific issue like energy or diet, agriculture, and to take them through this process of understanding the relationship between those systems or patterns of behavior or consumption practices or whatever that they're interested in, in a way that allows them to draw out the connections between their issue and all of these other layers without dichotomizing the subjectivity in the systemic structure. And that's basically what we're working on, and we'll have time, at least on Thursday, for more questions, but yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. And yeah. I'll also, like you said, we can share our slides. I have like all the resources and stuff and readings and contact information. So, thank you.